TPC works the same way as DCA in the sense that it works with RF grouping, and it's just below. You have RF grouping, TPC and DCA in the same group of RM. So here are a few things you need to be aware of. First of all, it's also set to automatic, and the interval at which you run TPC is going to be tied to the DCA interval. So you configure this 600 second here in the DCA page. If you set to 24 hours, you'll see that number change. But that's not where you configure a specific value for TPC that would be different from DCA. They work together. So this is just displaying what you configure on the other page. That's one thing. Remember here, if you change it here, then it's going to affect TPC as well. The second thing is you can set it to automatic, which is the default, or you can just do like DCA, set it to on demand, which means that you don't do TPC anymore until you check that invoke power update once, and then it just does it when you check that box. Or you fix it and you can assign a static power value to all your access points. Again, recommendation is to use automatic. That's the best one, so you have a different power for DAPs depending on where they are and what happens around them. But if you want to, or if you have a good reason to, you can statically set the power for all your APs. Remember, 1 is the maximum amount of power that is allowed in that band in your country based on what access points you have. 2 is 3 dB less. So remember the equations. 3 dB less is half the power. So 2 is half of 1, and 3 is half of 2, etc. So every time you go down a number, you decrease your power by 3 dB, so you divide the power by 2. And we show here 1 because from one country to the next, this max power might be different. So if you go on the CLI and if you go on your access point, you can check the power of that AP. But in the screen of the controller configuration, we just say max power or half of it, etc. All right, so bring it back to automatic, which is the recommended value. Next below, you have the maximum power level and minimum power level. So what that is when you're going to change your access point power, there may be some cases where you do not want the access point power to grow too much to a too high a value or to decrease too much to too low a value. So here you can set maximum up and maximum down increases for your power, plus 30 or minus 10. So that gives you a sort of a windowing capability so that you don't let your APs go down too low to a power where they don't hear neighbors anymore or where they are too powerful for your environment and that creates some echoes. There may be some cases where you may need to constrain the AP changes. Most of the time you want to keep those defaults, right? But you may change them if you want. And what the game is about, TPC, is that the APs want to hear one another at a level that you define here, power threshold, which is minus 70 by default. So that's a good value in most environments. In some environments, if you know that your APs are very close to one another because it's a high density environment, you may know that APs are likely to hear one another louder because they are close. And if they decrease so much that they are down to minus 70, then your cells may be too small. So in that case, you may have to change that value to something lower like minus 68 or minus 65. In some other environments where the APs are far apart, you may know that there is no way they can hear one another at minus 70, and you may change this value to something higher. I don't know, minus 72 or something like that. And the number of neighbors that you want each AP to hear is below. You cannot change it from the graphical interface, but that gives you an idea. Each AP should be heard by 3 APs at about minus 70. And here again, it's a RF grouping, right? So the power assignment leader is the same result as in DCA from the election of the RF group. Oh, by the way, there are 2 versions of TPC, V1 and V2, and you see that we are on V1. So let's be clear on something. Unless you have very, very good reasons to do so, do not change to TPC V2. TPC V2 is a lot more complex algorithm for high-density environment with real-time applications where there are some limitations for TPC V1. So it's very specific, so don't think that because it's the latest version V2, it's better than V1. No, it's a different version for a different type of environment. So unless you are instructed by TAG for troubleshooting some RF issues in your environment, do not change from V1 to V2. V1 is the one you want to run by default. Now, if you go down to the general configuration of RRM, this is where you'll see the channel scan interval. Remember, we're saying that the AP is going to scan at a real interval the other channels, and then we'll do an entire cycle every 180 seconds by default. This is where you configure it, 180 seconds. You can change this default if it doesn't work well in your environment, but again, there is no reason why you would need to. And just below, there is the neighbor packet frequency. You know, the NDP message that we said was exchanged every 60 seconds by default. Well, you can change that interval here as well. There is a window value for those two, so you cannot change it to, I don't know, 1,000 seconds or something. If you try to put a value, the controller will tell you what max and minimum values are allowed, you know, because they would make sense. But there are a few changes that you can make here if you need to. Again, unless you're instructed by TAC or unless you're trying to solve a specific problem and you know that this is the cause of the problem, you probably do not want to change those numbers. You just want to be aware that they are here.